Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today's lesson is called the last acceleration and the connected swing. So to bring everyone up to speed very quickly on this, where we've been, we started out with talking about this sort of high take back and Mr. Miyagi and the Karate Kid, the wax off sort of thing. And then we start a drop and we have it into a slotted position. And you can see that in the background here with the Djokovic photo. And then from the slot, we have the first move out of the slot, which is this movement with the rack of the head trailing our pulling hand as we move out to the right initially, just for a few fractions of a second really, but it's an important movement that we don't want to miss. And then the master move, which is both lowering the racket head from the hand and the supination of the forearm, so that if the forearm pit is pointed towards you at the camera with pronation, supination is just the reverse. It's now the pit of my elbow is pointed up. So we're laying the racket back and keeping the lag intact as we move out into the swing circle at the turn of the swing. And you can see that again with Djokovic in the background. So today we're going to be talking, and we talked a little about it last time with the Bruce Lee swing, is the last phase from the turn of the swing when the body and the non-hitting arm has started to pivot our body towards the opponent finally. We kept our lag, and now we're going to really fully release this racket on edge in this windshield wiper action, coming up into contact. And you can see that in this image. I see a few other things that we haven't talked about, which we will, which is that in this last movement, the rotation of the body, the upper body and torso and shoulders continues to do the pulling. And the non-hitting side is pulling us around, and you look at this non-hitting hand, and we'll talk about that in detail. It's pulling the right side, hitting side in our shoulder and arm through, so that at contact, the right shoulder is quite well advanced of the left shoulder, as you can see. And that we're really, having the full release of the power that we stored up in our chest and muscles in our back. And we're releasing that power into the shot. And then as we come into contact, we're also typically pronating the forearm, increasing the vertical acceleration and rise through contact that's going to give us both power and spin. And you can see that in the background as well in the Djokovic. And because we're releasing this freely and we're not steering it and manipulating control, there's going to be continued acceleration right through the first part of contact. And we see it in the background as well. And so all these ideas about controlling this and catching the racket after it goes through contact, we'll see the reasons why they should be thrown out the window, and that this should be a blazing fast and full release of the racket. So those are the issues that we'll be covering and more in the next couple lessons, but this one in particular, the last acceleration, and how this arm stays connected in this swinging action, this rotating action, and how it doesn't get away from us. We can lose the swing easily in this last acceleration phase, and we don't want to do that. So it's appropriate that we spend a couple lessons and quite a bit of time on this phase of the swing, because it is the most critical phase of the swing. This is everything that we'll ever learn about the swing has to come into play in this last fraction of a second. This is the moment where we're putting all the wood behind the arrow, as they say in the corporate world. And we're releasing this devastatingly powerful topspin forehand at our opponent. Poor opponent who hasn't heard of the kinetic whip swing. Let's get started. As you can see, I'm in a feisty mood today, and that's appropriate because we're getting to the real deciding moments in our swing, and we want to be a little bit, well, maybe even a little bit more than aggressive. We want to be aggressive and decisive. Remember, the stages of learning that we're going started with large circles, sort of methodically just getting in the ballpark of what we're supposed to be doing, and then we move to smaller circles. These are the smaller movements where we refine them, and eventually we want to get to no circles where we're not doing any thinking at all. And so we're passing through these stages as we do these lessons, especially during the practice, and it's appropriate to be thinking about these further stages in the release, because there's no way we can consciously control this blazing fast action from the slot, turn of the swing, and into the release. You know, it's just a fraction of a second. So, you know, part of the journey here is, you know, and part of the enjoyment and the experience of sport is transforming our way of thinking. Typically, we live our lives in a slow, deliberate way, and that's the way we should, because they're important decisions that we have to make, and we have to think through all the information and context appropriately. And that's great for that. There was a book published by 2 Nobel Prize winners, Fast Thinking and Slow Thinking, and they basically said that there's appropriate spheres for each of this kind of thinking. Well, the neat thing about sport is that we're going to transform our thinking from slow to very fast to no thinking at all. In terms of these stages of emotional tone that we go through, in the last acceleration, we've gone from a very quiet, neutral mind, uncommitted, to a very decisive, aggressive mindset as we release this racket. And in terms of mindset and, you know, follow-on positions, you know, there's people out there emphasize that in the follow-through of the topspin, our left hand should be above our shoulder here with our palm facing our opponent as if we're waving to them. I will suggest to you that that's both the wrong message and the wrong movement, but we'll get into the movement later. But it's much more of a internal shoulder rotation, and the hand being sort of out here, tucked in down here like this. And for the purposes of this lesson, if you want a message to your opponent, well, we should let our racket do the messaging mostly, but if you want a message for your opponent of your kinetic whip topspin shot, I would suggest that it's more not hi, but bye-bye. So before we get to the mindset of the last acceleration and the movements therein, I want to talk about the mindset of getting loaded. And I was having a discussion with one of my colleagues, and he asked me in a discussion, is that I ever heard the expression that tennis is a game of emergencies. And so we had a brief discussion on this, and the more I thought about it, the more I don't particularly like that mentality. Why is that? Well, yes, at all times, in all circumstances, there are times when we don't have enough time and it becomes an emergency to swing. But most of the time, and certainly at the recreational level, we do have time, and that we're really creating an emergency by a certain kind of mindset. So first of all, I just want you to play you a couple videos of Djokovic, just how quick one ground stroke is. The next sequence is what happens after Djokovic hits his topspin forehand, playing at the baseline. How long does it take for the ball to come back to him, playing it against that level of opponent? As you can see, it only took 1 second for the ball to travel back to him after he hit it. And to my friend who said that tennis is a game of emergencies, well, he would say that's an example. You know, even Djokovic on the baseline only has 1 second. But I would say that 1 second is quite a bit of time in sports and in tennis. And I would also say that at a recreation level, we have to realize that a recreation player hitting from the topspin from the baseline has 2 to 3 seconds before the ball is going to come back. First of all, his opponent doesn't hit and prepare as quickly as a pro, right? And they're sending the ball back at maybe 10, 15 miles an hour as opposed to 50, 60 miles an hour. So there's really a 2 to 3 second lapse from a recreation player hitting on the baseline and having that ball return. And that's an enormous amount of time for a tennis player. And so what does the typical recreation player do with those 2 to 3 seconds? Well, the answer is they're watching the ball and doing nothing. They're standing relatively frozen, relatively unprepared, and watching the ball come, cross the net, land on their side of the court, and now is approaching them. And guess what? Yes, then it's an emergency. So we make the game into an emergency by not preparing early enough. And that's the point I want to make here and dwell on. And I mentioned this before, that when recreation players miss hit, one of the things you'll always hear out there on the courts is the player yelling at himself, watch the ball, stupid. Well, I would say that watching the ball is not the problem. It's the idea that we should watch the ball all the time is the problem. So what do we do when we are really watching the ball? What do the linesmen and the referees and umpires do in tennis? You know, they put their hands on their knees, they hunch forward, and they just stare completely immobile because they are concentrating on watching that line call, right? This is mentally what happens when we're focused on watching the ball alone. We're staring at the ball, it's doing things, we're not doing anything, and we're waiting for it to land on our side of the court, and then we have an emergency. So, am I saying don't watch the ball? Well, in some ways I am saying that. That should not necessarily be our first thought. And at the end of this, when we get to the deliberate practice part of it, I'll have what I think may be the first don't watch the ball drill in tennis instruction history. And I think you'll see what I mean, that we can be doing other things besides watching the ball and to play better tennis. So what other mindset do we need to get going and prepare early so that we can deliver a last acceleration? Well, we have to have a clear intent of our movement map in our minds before we even begin. We have to have a clear understanding of what it is that we're going to be doing and how to organize our body. And I think I mentioned early on that as a recreation player, if you ask me, you know, after the match, you know, show me your topspin forehand, I really couldn't recreate it very well. I didn't really understand the movements. I didn't understand what I did first, last, or the middle. And so this is why I've called these lessons movement map lessons, is we have to come to a much clearer understanding of how we're going to do this movement and the particular phases of it. And particularly, we need to have an understanding of the first move. That's really key in any movement, and it has to be very clear in our mind what it is that we're going to do. And so I would suggest that we have models for this in the GOATs, and I've given you 3, but you can choose your favorite player. And I would suggest that the first move should be going from this neutral state to a first stage of our loading. You notice I haven't used the term unit turn, which I think is a very poor expression. Why? Because the unit turn basically says the player should move their shoulders and hips in the same way as a unit and turn to the side here, like I'm doing now. Well, that's fine, but we haven't really accomplished any loading at that point. We've just turned our body to the side. We have no separation and stretch between our upper body and our lower body, which is really the source of our power on the swing. So in this first stage, you can look at Federer. They usually have a different style, but they bring it up here, slightly behind their head, both hands on the racket, his hand on the throat. And that's stage one of this first move. And when we get into the practice, we'll be showing you some drills on how to emphasize that. But having clarity of intent that, you know, we really have a clear first move and that we can move quickly and get ready much more quickly than we're doing. So once we're in this prepared stage, then there might become time for more watching of the ball. But unless we prepare early, it's not going to do us much good to be watching that ball. In fact, it'll be counterproductive. Specifically, what we're looking for on this first move is the start of the separation between the shoulder and the hips, so that our shoulders, our hips only turn 40 degrees, but the shoulders can turn another 45 degrees. So we don't want a full turn at the first move, but we want to start that greater turn of the shoulders and upper torso from the body in this position. This is going to lead then to the further turn and coiling in the full take back. So how do we know we're really coiling? So let's just take a closed stance for now. So the two things to be cognizant of is where your belly button is facing and where your sternum, the middle of your chest, is facing. So if I do the classic unit turn where there's no coiling, my belly button is faced straight out here and the sternum of my chest is faced straight out here. What we want to see is that the sternum and our chest has turned back much, not a lot further, but, you know, sort of at this range away, and started this separation, and then our belly button may stay here, fading there, but our chest has turned and we've started our coil. It sounds very simple, but very few people do it. And right away we're down the wrong track. So we'll get this into the practice, but just so you get a heads up on this, is that in this first move, we're looking for the chest, sternum to have more of a turn than our belly button. So critical in this sequencing of actions that we've talked about in our physical movements, there's a sequencing of sort of emotional states as well. So when we're first getting ready to prepare, we're in a very neutral state and a calm and observing state, but we're quickly going to move through different phases of emotional tone in our first movements, and particularly. So in our first movement, there are several variations that I want you to look at, but each person has a different personality. You can see with Federer, it's all graceful and light. With Djokovic, it's a little bit more mechanical and high. And with Nadal, you know, it's a little bit more like the bullfighter, like his symbol is. He's sort of up here, sort of like a matador, ready to stick the sword in the charging bull. So the different elements of our personality can come through on these movements, but we're going to be focusing on this first movement. And just in terms of large circles, even though this lesson is focused on the last acceleration, I still want to do a little preliminary on the first bits of the acceleration. So we have to, as I've said before, we have to get loaded before we can unload. So we have to get loaded before we can even get to this last acceleration. And that's what I want to look at here. And the third thing that we want to be cognizant of and start to practice more is how the non-hitting hand can help us in this initial loading and coiling. So we haven't talked too much about it. We'll talk about it more later, but we're talking about taking the racket back with two hands instead of the recreation player split. And we're talking about a more athletic stance where there's a forward tilt to the body. So why is this important? Well, if we're a typical recreation player standing straight and we try to turn or coil, we're coiling from the lower lumbar region of our back, which can only turn 5 to 10 degrees. So it's really quite almost impossible to turn very much and coil properly if we're standing too erect. Now, what is it about this forward athletic posture that is so important in coiling? It's because our mid-back and thoracic spine, the vertebrae that run through here in our chest, this has 45 degrees of rotation around this axis. And this is what we want to be coiling around and uncoiling around on this tilted axis through our spine. This is going to give us the ability for the take back that we want, the power storage that we want, and for the motion and release that we want. So we have to move the rotation from the lower mid-body standing straight, where we have no rotation capability, to the mid-back, where we have all kinds of rotation capability. But now that we have an athletic stance and have a 20 or 30 degree forward tilt of our body, so now our mid-back is free to rotate and move back and forth, we need this non-hitting arm to do more work than it's doing now. Unless you're at a very high level player, typically we have no use of it. We have a split hands standing straight mode of being like this, right? So we're going to change that, and we're going to exaggerate like we do all things when we break habits. We're going to want to move this non-hitting arm way behind us as we take this racket back and break our hands. We'll go through this in the deliberate practice session, but these are all about getting going and a proper loading of the body so that we can release the energy of that into this last acceleration. Now that we've covered the preliminaries, let's really get into the last acceleration phase. Now, the last acceleration phase of the swing begins really after the first move out of the slot. And we talked about this master move in which we lay back the hand following the pulling body and racket. We extend the racket down here a little depending on how much topspin we want, and we can adjust this as we move into the swing. There's a great adjustability in this. And we supinate our forearm back, laying the racket back instead of early pronating it this way. And so we have our non-hitting arm out here, and we're turning now after the first move, really turning into with our chest and head facing the opponent. That's the last turn of the swing. So what happens is, should happen, is that the pulling of the body action continues all the way through contact. And that this non-hitting arm and side, and we'll discuss this in great detail, keeps pulling all the way through, pulling the hitting side in front of the torso, in front of the left shoulder, so that the right is now prominently ahead of the left. And that when that pulling motion starts to come to a stop and actually freezes on the non-hitting side with an action that we'll talk about, this is what some people consider the waving the opponent position. Then the rotation of the body has come to a stop almost totally. And this gives the anchor point for this right side then to shoot through in a free release of the racket. And we see that the summation of all the kinetic energy that's flowed up through our body, then into our shoulder and into our arm and hand, and finally into the racket with our hand leading, we're able to deliver that topspin shot right here. The hand in front of the racket at contact, just like in golf, allows us to give extra sort of press and leverage on the ball that we'll talk more about in the next lesson, but that's the idea. Now, as I've also talked before, many things can go wrong at the last part of the swing. For Coco Golf, I was talking about how things go wrong right from the top of the backswing, and this thing gets blown out on the swing circle too soon, the arm straightens, etc. All bad things. But I also talked about how even the best players, and I gave you an example of Serena Williams, when they lose confidence in their form and they start to get into the turn of the swing, then they sort of go into a panic mode, even though they might not say that. And they're nervous and their body stops rotating. And now the arm disconnects from this rotational movement and now starts to maneuver on its own. And players try to consciously try to manufacture the right contact point out here in the swing. That creates all kinds of mishits and all kinds of errors. And so that's part of the process here, is to building the confidence so that doesn't happen. But I also want to talk about another dimension of how this swing goes wrong. Another dimension of why the swing goes wrong in the last stages is simply a faulty movement map that we have in our minds. What constitutes the core of this faulty movement map? Well, there are several things, but for most players, typically in a swing, they splitting their arms early, taking the racket back in this sort of linear manner from the target, as I'm showing you here, like I showed with John McEnroe in the 80s. This is the way people used to swing, even at a high level. And there's going to be more or less a linear path of the swing right to the target. And then, yes, there's a follow through of some kind there. But it's this linear swing path to the target that is embedded in so many of our minds. It was embedded in mine, and I had to overcome it in my evolution. And that's what we're working on today in particular. So, how did we get there? Well, we have instructors who teach that way still, and even a lot of today's instructors, while they talk about the unit turn and the coil back here, and they even talk about some of the things that we've talked about, many of them either subtly or explicitly talk about throwing the hand towards the target, or throwing the racket head towards the target, or the butt of the racket towards the target. There's all these sort of linear dimensions to what they're teaching, and this affects the most critical moment of the swing. And so we go from a rotational start, perhaps, and then we move into a semi-modified linear to the target swing that causes all kinds of issues. And the people will say, well, I still play great tennis that way, I can still hit the ball hard that way, and I can still beat most people that way, and those things can all be true. But the model is not the best model, as I've been explaining. And once you learn a better technique and model, it will substantially reduce the number of hitting errors and substantially increase your winners and substantially increase the number of matches you're going to win if you can evolve yourself in that direction. So in terms of generating a rotational swing, I want to remind you of sort of where we began in this series and in the channel, which is the goal of GOAT Tennis is to realize your full potential as an athlete and as a tennis player. So why did I introduce this concept of athlete? Well, I'll explain in a second. But I said we do that through three methods: having a better movement map, more accurate one, a more complete one, according to the best technique, and focusing on the principles and feels of the swing, particularly as opposed to static positions around the swing path. And this is the reason why we went deep into the idea of the kinetic chain and how the human body has evolved over 2 million years as hunter-gatherers. 99.99% of our human history evolved to be hunter-gatherers, where gradually the human body changed such that man became the greatest thrower in the animal kingdom by far. the most efficient, most powerful, and the most accurate. Why? Because then we could throw spears and sticks and we could kill game at a distance, feed ourselves better, etc. You know the drill for evolving evolution. So this kinetic chain is how human beings produce power and speed in both throwing and swinging. The idea is that the swing is underlying it is a throwing motion that has been evolved for 2 million years to make it more efficient. And the kinetic chain itself is a rotational engine. So the 32 segments of the human body that constitute the rotation to the kinetic chain, they're all measured in degrees of rotation and revolutions per second. And in the background, I'm showing you sort of a mapping of that. And you can see in the middle there where I have the lumbar rotation, which is the lower back area. And why I said if you stand erect, this whole idea of a rotational swing is restricted because you're trying to rotate around something that can only rotate 5 degrees here. This is why we need a more athletic stance with a tilted forward spine that we have in all swing sports and baseball and golf as well. You notice the golfers start like this. Baseball players may stand up here ready, but when they swing, they're in the same athletic posture. Why? Because the mid-back and the thoracic spine is where we have all of our rotational capability, 40, 45 degrees each way, both in the coiling and uncoiling. So understanding the context of the kinetic chain and how we produce power and speed sets up everything that we're doing. Now I'm bringing up this whole idea of the rotational swing because it is a subject of controversy, both in tennis and in baseball, where not all instructors agree on the rotational nature of the swing. In golf, it's not the same. Everyone agrees, and has agreed since 1957 when Ben Hogan, one of the GOAT candidates, published his famous 5 lessons book that people are still studying and detailed and mapped out the whole nature of the rotational golf swing. And people are still learning from it, and no one has ever contradicted the basic findings among any top golf instructor. In baseball, we still have some instructors and some popular instructors who will say, yeah, we get all this coiling and loading in the back. That's obvious with the bat up here. And then we have an uncoiling. And then we should do something linear with our hands. We should throw them out, make the shortest distance to the barrel of the bat, to the ball, and square it up here with our hands in a straight motion because we want the ball to go straight. Then our barrel of our bat must go straight here through contact. And that is a common sense notion that we see echoed in so much tennis instruction as well. You just can't get it out of their minds that common sense tells me that this racket has to swing through linear to the target for the ball to go straight to the target. When in fact, as you'll see in the videos that follow and all I've shown before, is that you can have a pure rotational swing and that rotational arc intersects the ball at a certain point in the swing where the racket is squaring to the target. The ball sinks in and is directed linear to the target, and the swing continues in this rotational manner. There's no re-steering or redirecting, as so many instructors have taught you, and it's going to lead to all sorts of problems. And I'll explain in future lessons sort of many of the other reasons why this idea of the linear swing still holds sway. But a very simple fact is that most videos on YouTube that you see are shot from the angle that I'm shooting this at, from a face-on point of view. And so even a rotational swing, even in slow motion, will have much more of an appearance of a linear path through contact. And you'll see that and I'll show you in a moment, the best way to see the true rotational nature of any swing is to be shooting from the rear of the player to the target here. This is when we can capture the shape of the swing more accurately. So now I'm showing you a couple of the swings I made, baseball swing and a golf swing in slow motion. As you can see, I shot it from the rear, and you'll see the same elements that we see in all good. You know, you'll see a coiling and turning back of the upper part of the body against the lower body as you load. And you will see an unwinding and the elbow sinking down, just as we talked about with the elbow whip. And you'll see that the bat at the first part of the swing is moving close into the body behind it, trailing the hands. And then as we get to the turn of the swing, the arms extend out. Contact is made at the right moment, and the follow through happens, all in a rotational move, as you're just seeing now. And once you understand these principles, you can go out and swing a bat in a golf and have a pretty decent swing quickly. I haven't played baseball in, well, decades, and in 15 minutes I was able to put together the swing that you see. Same with golf. I haven't really played but a few times in decades. And again, you see the turn and coil, the hands going up high. You see a drop into the slot where the elbow and the hands are coming down, but trailing the pulling body and the pulling hands. And then you see the turn into the swing and the free release of the club head at a much faster speed than we produce in baseball. I mean, in tennis, our swing speed may be 50, 60, 70 miles an hour at a professional level in tennis. The average speed for a club head driver on the pro tour is 120 miles an hour, 121. So almost twice as fast they're going through this moment of contact. And their actual moment of contact is only 1/10 of the time that we have with the ball in tennis, because we have a hard club and a hard golf ball. There's just a fraction of a second that ball's in contact with the club head, and it still directs it straight down the fairway. Any deviation, 1 degree or another at contact, is going to send the ball typically out of bounds. So how is it possible that these golfers are swinging so hard and so accurately and so efficiently? Well, it's all built into the things that we've been talking about, how we use the laws of physics to help us throw the club head out on this swing circle, and that the center of mass of the club, whether it's a bat or a racket or whatever, tends to rotate this head around, barrel around, club head around, and tends to square it to contact at the right moment if it's driven by the body's rotation. If it's not driven by the body's rotation, if the arm becomes disconnected, then we're going to generate all kinds of errors. Now, to complete the cycle of the rotational model that we're talking about, I'll show you Jack Sock that we filmed from the rear. And Jack Sock, why Jack Sock? Well, I consider him a GOAT candidate for topspin forehand. He produces as much spin and power as Rafa, and generally was acknowledged on the tour as having a great forehand. Now, why didn't he win Grand Slam titles? Well, all the rest of his game wasn't nearly up to the level of his topspin forehand. If it was, he would have won won multiple titles, I believe. I think generally people would think that as well, but he didn't. But still, for the technique of topspin forehand, he had a tremendous technique that we can all learn from and study. And you'll see, you know, a different kind of coiling. You'll see more elbow-driven power with Sock. You'll see a more compact form, but you can see that the form that we're talking about, where the elbow leads the swing back and forward, and this tremendous amount of power stored in this short amount of space in this rotational action, can produce tremendous power and spin. So as we move along here, I want to encourage you to start leaving behind the old linear swing and pushing to the target, the levering action of the arm in this linear manner, and evolve to the true rotational swing that goats at the highest level utilize in all sports now. It never used to be that way. It's only the last 20 or 30 years that things have really evolved in tennis to be much more rotational in nature. So even in our rotational manner, where we lose the swing often is that we lose the pulling rotational power of the body as we move into the turn of the swing, and our body stops here, maybe with our chest going out in this direction, and now the arm is starting to have to power through to contact and become disconnected from the body and create all these other issues. So I want to talk now about how this non-hitting arm, just like we talked about the non-hitting arm in the coiling and loading, how on the unloading it plays a much more pivotal role than you think maybe or you've ever tried. But we're going to try that. So that when we're loading, and we've extended our arms way back here now and stretched the muscles in our back, and we can feel that stretch. Now we've loaded our body properly so that we have that whole stretch to pull the body in this swinging circle, in this tilted axis that we have going up through contact. And the non-hitting arm is pulling, pulling, pulling. And as opposed to most people who sort of let it drop or just let it stop, or they lose the dynamic tension of this pull, you know, I want you to be able to really focus how this is pulled back much more sharply. It's not pulled around on this wide arc, that's too wide. We have much more of a tucking motion of this left side in. And as opposed to what these other instructors have said about, well, the position we want to end up is with the hand, you know, waving at the opponent, the palm sort of facing the opponent over here. And in doing so, I've executed an external rotation of my non-hitting shoulder. See, this is external, this is internal. And what happens instead for most players, especially the new generation, and even I'll show you the old goats that I have, Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic, more typically, that's not how they execute this move. More typically, in the hand is palm down, up, it can be various things, but instead of a external rotation of the non-hitting shoulder, there's a internal tucking of the shoulder, internal rotation, and the hand moves down more like this, and there's sort of a bracing arm action, hand action, as if, you know, we're really freezing the left side like this. And it can look like this, it can look like this, and various things. But the more important thing is the internal arm rotation and tucking. So why is this better? Why is this the preferred method? Because we're basically turning, rotating, right? And now we're getting to the point where we want to stop that rotation. If I externally rotate this shoulder, there's going to be a tendency for those shoulders to swing in rotation even further. So it's just not as effective a way of bracing and freezing the rotation as the internal tucking. And so what we'll see is this internal tuck, maybe the hand out like this, the non-hitting side now, since the left side is frozen or coming to a halt, the right side can come shooting through with an anchor point, a pivot point, if you will. This is an anchor or pivot point for this rotation. And it makes a tremendous amount of difference if that rotation is anchored and this left side is stopped, in increasing our swing speed and free release of the racket at contact. So we'll look in more detail of this as we go into the deliberate practice section of the video for one further confirmation of what I was saying about this internal rotation and the tucking of the hand and the shoulder here. Is if you watch any professional pitcher for the last 100 years maybe, and I'll show you a couple of pictures here in the background or in the next video segment, is that almost all pitchers, as they complete their rotational throwing action and they start to come through in the release phase, very similar to what we have. The left side now has to be stopped so that the right side can accelerate through. They almost always tuck their glove in this internal rotation down here. Down, not up here, but down here, because this is where the major part of the rotation of the body is going up and over, just like we do in tennis. And so this is the universal action of professional pitchers, and they've studied this umpteen million ways, and you can look at any video yourself. But it's just further confirmation that if we understand the technique principles and not get focused on a particular position of the hand, we can both improve our technique and, you know, eliminate a lot of problem areas. And so once again, understanding that the principle of the non-hitting arm stoppage is to stop the rotation of the body so that the hitting side and hitting arm can rotate through faster and more efficiently. So now I'll show you a close-up of Djokovic, Federer, and Nadal all executing this pulling motion all the way through contact, all executing an internal elbow tuck, internal rotation of this non-hitting side, and this sort of arresting with their hand motion of some kind, and then the being able to press and release into contact. So the next lesson after this, we'll be talking more about the right side's role in this rotating action. And there is a definite role for the right throwing side. Yes, the swing should be led by a pulling action, but as we turn into the last acceleration, there's a more definite role for a more active action on the hitting side that we'll get into. But for this lesson, we're focusing on the complete pulling action, the stopping of the rotation, and the acceleration of the hitting arm and shoulder, and we'll be checking to see that this hitting side is advanced enough for you to further develop this technique. We're now in the deliberate practice section of this lesson. Deliberate practice is where we actually do the physical exercises and cover the concepts of the movement map that we've just discussed. And I want to pick up where we left off in the movement map area, which is this initial loading position, and remind you again that in order to load and unload properly, coil and uncoil, we need a tilted posture, an athletic posture, basically like you're guarding someone in basketball. So a slight 20% or so tilt of the spine forward. We want our chest to be sort of erect here. We want bent knees and flexible movement already sort of building in our posture before we even begin. So that's where we're going to start. In this first exercise, I'm going to focus on that initial loading position that I showed you at the end of the movement map with Federer, Djokovic, Nadal, is where they're turning, raising their hands, taking the racket back into this slightly behind the head fashion. And, we're sort of pausing maybe at that point, waiting for the ball to come. But we need to arrive at this much more quickly than we typically do at a recreational level. And so I want you to, again, do this without a racket. For those new to deliberate practice, we usually start without rackets because when we pick up a racket, it triggers all our old habits that we're trying to break. So we usually start without the racket in our hands. And so for this exercise, I want you to imagine your hands holding a small ball, maybe 6 inches wide here. So I want both arms to come back and up behind the head in this pause position. And I want a slight separation between the upper torso and the hips. So if I'm here, I want just a 5 or 10% sort of extra coil in my shoulders. This may be exaggerated at this point, and you may not need this later on, but again, we have to exaggerate a little to break our old habits. So we really want to start to think about getting loaded on our topspin forehand. And so this is the first part that we're going to work on. So I'll pause the video. I want to give you one other idea, is that I want you to use a different mental cueing word than maybe you have thought about. And I just want that word to be load. So I don't want you to say it out loud, but I want to have you say it loudly in your head as you're waiting and preparing for that first movement. So it's hopefully going to trigger you to be a little bit quicker and a little bit more loading in your load. And so I'll pause the video for you to do 10 of these repetitions. You can choose whatever GOAT topspin forehand candidate you have. You can choose Federer, Nadal, Djokovic. Do it like they do it. I suggest you try to emulate them at the beginning. This is the outer map, just so you can get a checkpoint and look back on these and say, oh yeah, I wasn't quite doing it the way he did it. And so you can refine your technique that way. So I'll pause the video for you to do 10 load to the initial position, load and wait, where your back foot is a little bit more loaded than your front foot, no matter what stance you're in, but you're in a balanced waiting position. You're not leaning back, forward, whatever. You're nice and paused here, hands high, slightly behind your head. Now we'll do the same exercise with the racket in our hand. Again, reminder, we're gonna grip in our fingers, not flat palm against it on the side like this, Eastern forehand, we don't want that. I want you to experiment with semi-Western and Western grip, which is the pad of our index finger on the 4th or 5th bevel for Western, 4th bevel for semi-Western, and the control of the racket in these bottom 3 fingers, because we want to be able to release this racket in this throwing edge whipping motion like this. Best done with control with the bottom 3 fingers. Don't need these 2 fingers, which Ben Hogan called the swing killers. Why the swing killers? Because same thing in golf. If you place your hand to the palm, to the side of the racket, like an Eastern forehand, and it's just going to encourage you in this horizontal levering motion that we want to eliminate. So grip is important. You can do it with an Eastern forehand. Federer did it, but it's just a little bit harder. I'd like to move along to trying the semi-Western or Western grip. So again, we'll use the same cueing word. So you're in a ready position, athletic posture, slightly bent forward, and your mind is going to be blank except for thinking about the load word in your mind to get you to move more quickly and turn and pause and wait. Balanced position, we're waiting here quickly. We might have to wait quite a while, but we can wait quite a while here. We can get in motion and get in ready to prepare and load much quicker than we're doing. So I'm going to pause the video for you to do 10 of these just with a racket. Now we'll do the same exercise with the racket in our hand. Again, reminder, we're going to grip in our fingers, not flat palm against it on the side like this, Eastern forehand, we don't want that. I want you to experiment with semi-Western and Western grip, which is the pad of our index finger on the 4th or 5th bevel for Western, 4th bevel for semi-Western, and the control of the racket in these bottom 3 fingers, because we want to be able to release this racket in this throwing edge whipping motion like this. Best done with control with the bottom 3 fingers. Don't need these 2 fingers, which Ben Hogan called the swing killers. Why the swing killers? Because same thing in golf. If you place your hand to the palm, to the side of the racket, like an Eastern forehand, and it's just going to encourage you in this horizontal levering motion that we want to eliminate. So grip is important. You can do it with an Eastern forehand. Federer did it, but it's just a little bit harder. I'd like to move along to trying the semi-Western or Western grip. So again, we'll use the same cueing words. So you're in a ready position, athletic posture, slightly bent forward, and your mind is going to be blank except for thinking about the load word in your mind to get you to move more quickly and turn and pause and wait. Balanced position, we're waiting here quickly. We might have to wait quite a while, but we can wait quite a while here. We can get in motion and get in ready to prepare and load much quicker than we're doing. So I'm going to pause the video for you to do 10 of these just with a racket. So we're sort of passing through this phase now to load out here. And that's what I want you to do, 10 shadow practices, and I'll pause the video for you to do that. We're back out here on court, and this is where we're going to do the don't watch the ball drill, I promise you. So the intent behind these next couple drills is to replace the watch the ball mentality with mentality of quick decision and quick loading that we're missing. So for this drill, you will need a training partner to feed you balls, or a wall, or a ball machine. I'll assume you have a training partner. And the idea is that, you know, you're going to get set up as the feeder, the trainer. Usually it's best just to do an underhand toss like this, because it takes a lot of practice skills to feed the ball consistently to your partner over there. We want to give him a nice consistent throw and bounce to him so he can work on his topspin, or his topspin forehand. The next sequence here, we're going to add one layer of complexity to this very simplistic drill. So I gave you the cue word of load, which is getting all the way back here with both arms extended back and high. That's going to trigger you for a quicker movement. And in terms of the actual hit, I'm giving you another cue word, which is release, which is different than a mentality of hit the ball or watch the ball. There's a freedom to this word. We're not holding anything back. We're releasing on this edge throw that we've been talking about. And so we have 2 cue words, load and release. Load and release. Load and release. And I want to do it rapidly, but those are the only 2 words that I want to hear in your voice, or hear in your head. Even though I can't hear what's going on in your head, that's what you should hear. So just having done those 2 don't watch the ball drills, reflect on your experience. Did you really not watch the ball? Did you miss any balls because you weren't watching the ball? I'm gonna project that you didn't. Maybe one, but watching the ball is not the issue. It's early preparation so that we don't feel rushed, and a freedom of release into contact, sending the ball where we want it to send, not hitting at it, not watching it, but we're releasing our swing, and the racket's going to intersect with the ball the way it can on its own. We don't have to manipulate it and steer it, manage it consciously. We're going to let it go because we have the basic form that we have been talking about. And once you have that form, you don't have to worry about squaring the racket and getting proper contact. The last acceleration exercises, and during the movement map, I particularly emphasize the action of the non-hitting arm, and I want to continue with that. We'll cover other aspects of this in subsequent lessons. So first of all, I want you to do a little bit more with this non-hitting arm than maybe you're doing, even though we've gone through this exercise, is that as you take the racket back with both hands, non-hitting hand on the throat, you know, something like this, or like this for Djokovic or whatever, that typically players sort of extend this arm out for what they don't really understand the reason. Is sort of straight out from their body. It's not really loaded. It's just stretched out here a little, but not truly loaded and synced into the back muscles. And it's usually a little bit too far out. So as you're pulling the racket back up and behind you, I want you to keep the non-hitting arm a little bit closer to your body, and I want you to show the back of your hand to the camera going this way. So instead of doing something like this, which you might be doing, and that's fine, but for now I want you to use the back of your hand as your cue here as you pull back, and I want this arm, non-hitting arm, to come back more closely to the body so that, again, our hands are not that separated, not out like here, but out here. And so I want you to take it back like this, stretching this non-hitting arm back behind your hitting shoulder like I'm doing. And then I want you to just drop in slow motion, and I want you to keep the tension of this pulling action in the arm. So I don't want the arm to break down and collapse. I want to keep this pulling across my chest closer in the way I'm showing you here, instead of out here and then letting it lapse. I want you to, like you're on a pulley here, and you're focused on your muscles and your shoulder and your non-hitting side, pulling through. And I want you to see if you can pull this all the way through so that your right side now is advanced of your left side. So 10 repetitions, maybe the first 5 really slow, and then maybe speed it up for the last 5. I'll pause the video. So that last exercise was the general sense of pulling all the way through contact that we want, and the sort of positioning and dynamic of this whole non-hitting side. But now I want you to just focus on this last move that we discussed, which is, instead of, remember, so an external rotation of my hand would have my shoulder would have my hand facing you, and the internal would have the palm facing my face. So instead of the external rotation here, which will have a tendency to keep the rotation going, moving around too much, we're going to do what the goats are doing almost universally, which is a internal tuck of the shoulder, and the hand, it can be out here, you know, or in here, doesn't really matter. You see both. If you want to do it just like we showed in the video with the 3 goats, you could have it here. So we're pulling here, and we're tucking and arresting this rotational movement. And it's going to take you, this is kind of a strange motion when you're used to, you know, this external rotation. This internal tuck is a little bit different. So I don't want you to do the whole motion now. I just want you to think about doing this 10 times with an internal rotation where you feel the stoppage of the rotation a little bit more acutely than you maybe have been in the past. So don't worry about getting it exactly right, but let's do 10 repetitions, 5 really in slow motion, just so you kind of get the feeling of it, and then maybe just speed it up for the last 5. I'll pause the video. Now let's add those 2 exercises together with the take back, the non-hitting side, stretching out behind you, back of your palm facing out, outside there, your palm facing towards your face. So we're like here and it's closer to our body. We're coiled around this axis. So if we're too far out, we're not getting much internal coil. We want some internal tightening and coiling of the torso and all the muscles. So then we're going to be pulling all the way through, and then we're going to end with an abrupt internal tucking, internal shoulder rotation and tuck, hand in or out, doesn't matter, but a stoppage. So we're stopping, coming to a stop as this is progressing through. So 10 repetitions where we're doing the whole motion. Okay, I'll pause. Now, after our shadow work of using the non-hitting arm and side to pull us all the way through contact, done it in shadow work, but now we're back on a court and we will hit some balls this way. So the drill looks almost identical as the previous ones, where you're set up a little behind the service line and your partner is across the net on the same side. You're hitting cross court topspin forehands out of the line of fire. But this time we're concentrating on the last part of the swing, and we're concentrating on the pulling of the non-hitting side all the way through, and we're working on our tuck and stopping of that movement and letting this go and releasing it. So let's do 10 of those, and I'll pause the video. One last point on this hitting drill. I want you just to use one cueing word now, just the load part of it. So I want you to do everything else, but load is your cue. I'll pause the video. Again, we're going to repeat sort of the same way. Load and release, two cue words that I want in this swing, but we're going to keep refining and adding this pulling action with our shoulder and arm, and the arresting with an internal tuck, and see if we can drive this hitting side all the way through. And if you do have your camera set up, I would say have it set up here to the side, film this in regular speed. You look back on it again, and you can review how you're doing later on. So I'll pause the video and you can do this exercise. So we've covered quite a bit in this lesson of the first part of the last acceleration and connected swing lesson. And remember, we're not trying to do it right the first time. We're working with large circles, trying to get ourselves in the ballpark of the right movement map with basically the right principles and the right feels. And so I would encourage you to, do about 15 minutes of deliberate practice every day rather than try to do 1 or 2 hours at a time. It's better if you come back after a break and a night's sleep. You'll feel refreshed. You'll have a greater awareness and sensitivity to the cues and to the technique with this overnight sleep. But it's the consistency that we want, and it'll be your job to vary the drills. And if the cue words that I'm giving you don't quite work for you, then maybe other ones will. Instead of load, maybe it's prepare for you. But you have the concepts of how we break things down, how we focus on one thing at a time, how we add complexity. These are all the things that you can do with deliberate practice, and I'll again publish my top 10 recommendations for deliberate practice in the notes. And you can choose any of those or all of them and continue to refine your deliberate practice to the things that work for you. This is the scientific method. We try different things and see what works, and that's in another simplified way what deliberate practice is all about. So I want you to keep your eyes on the prize which is the development of this kinetic whip topspin forehand. And I want you to keep practicing.